Well, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Goff, President of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, and we welcome all of you here this afternoon, and from different parts of the world as well. We are delighted to have you here for Karoline Cook's presentation and our collaboration with the Islamic Center of New Mexico. Two very quick housekeeping things. If you have a question or comment, please place them in the chat function or chat box. At the end, we'll address as many of those as we can as time permits. And this presentation is being recorded and will soon be up on that is the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society's YouTube channel. We'll make that information available. And Dr. Cook is in the United Kingdom, and it's 11 o'clock at night there, so we're glad you could join us. Let me turn it over to Abbas Akil from the Islamic Center. Abbas?
Linda, thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure because this is the first time the Islamic Center is collaborating with the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. This is indeed a great collaboration, and we hope that we can do a lot more of these in the future. And I really want to also thank Dr. Cook. As you said, it's late at night there, and she has so generously agreed to participate and make this presentation. I'm really looking forward to it, and thank you very much. And hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. Thank you, Dr. Cook, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Okay. So, all right, my name is Gordon Brunitsky. Let me have the pleasure briefly of introducing our speaker. Karoline Cook is a lecturer in the history of the Atlantic world at Royal Holloway University of London and is currently at Oxford. What a delight. Her doctorate is from Princeton. Her area of research and teaching are the interconnections between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean worlds, and especially the Moriscos and the Spanish Empire. One thing I learned very quickly here is in New Mexico, you really have to tell people the difference between Moriscos and Moriscos. Big difference. And with that, I give it to Karoline Cook. Welcome and thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. Before I get started, I want to extend my warmest thanks to the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, the Islamic Center of New Mexico, and especially to Gordon Brunitsky, Linda Goff, and Abbas Akil for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here, and I look forward to everyone's questions also after my talk. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully this will work fairly seamlessly. And I think, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. I'm really excited to be here. My talk will focus on Moriscos in New Spain. And many of you may be familiar with the histories of the conversos in the Americas. The conversos were Jews, many of whom were forcibly converted to Catholicism, and their presence in lands that were part of the Spanish Empire has been really well studied. There have been a lot of really wonderful studies focused on the conversos in the Americas. But much less is known about the Moriscos. And this was what really prompted me to embark on this project in 2001, 2002, when I first went to the archives to see if there would be sort of similar information about the Moriscos and their presence in the Americas. So before I talk a little bit about Moriscos in the Americas, I wanted to go over sort of what is meant by the term Morisco and who were the Moriscos. And I wanted us to spend a little bit of time looking about the history of the Moriscos on the peninsula, because understanding this context is very important for getting a sense of their social status and relationships in the Americas. So who were the Moriscos? The term Morisco is very often used to refer to Muslims who converted to Christianity in Spain between the 15th and 17th centuries. And the label Morisco covers a really broad variety of people, many of whom were baptized voluntarily or forcibly baptized. So their identification as Muslims, as Christians would have varied. And it's important to remember that the Morisco populations across the Iberian Peninsula were very diverse and varied according to their specific and local histories, even as discourses that were taking shape in Spain by the 16th century began to conflate Moriscos under this sort of blanket term or label, and began to in ways that influence their legal status. So as I mentioned, the term Morisco was applied to a very diverse range of people. And it's important to remember that it was applied to people who weren't necessarily on the Iberian Peninsula. So people from North Africa or the Muslims from North Africa or the Philippines who convert to Christianity in Mexico or Peru might have been labeled Moriscos also. And it's also important to remember that Morisco was a social category that carried legal implications. As a label, it could affect a person's social status. In order to understand the position of the Moriscos in Spain and in Spanish America, it's also important to take into account the very long and complex history of what was taking place in Spain in the 15th and 16th centuries. So I'll spend the first portion of my talk sort of highlighting some of the changing policies that affected the Morisco status in Spain, and then how this affected their status in Spanish America. So when we think about the Iberian Peninsula, it was in the medieval period comprised of a series of kingdoms, Christian kingdoms and Islamic kingdoms. And there's a long history of Islam on the Iberian Peninsula, a long history of relationships between Christians, Muslims, and Jews living side by side in the Islamic and Christian kingdoms, experiencing periods of exchange, of trade, and also periods of conflicts. By the 13th century, the Emirate of Granada under the Nasrid rulers is the sort of last Islamic kingdom on the peninsula. In the preceding centuries, Christian armies in the northern kingdoms in Spain they began to undergo a series of sort of movements to seize control over the surrounding and neighboring kingdoms. So by 1232, Granada remains the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula. And it's also important to remember that in both the Islamic and Christian kingdoms, the legal status of religious minorities tended to be protected to the extent that Christians and Muslims living, Jews and Muslims living under Christian rule, in exchange for paying a tax to the ruler, were allowed to maintain their religious beliefs and practices and their own legal institutions. And this was also the case in the Islamic kingdoms, where Christian and Jewish minorities maintained a degree of religious and legal autonomy. But the situation begins to change with the marriage of the monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile in 1469. This marriage unites their kingdoms, and they begin a longer process of consolidation, creating institutions to strengthen their authority, and the union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon with their marriage has profound implications for religious minorities. We see this in the context of the creation of the Inquisition in the 1480s and the edicts expelling the Jewish population from the peninsula in 1492, and finally the sort of mobilization of the armies of Ferdinand and Isabel to seize control over Nasrid Granada, and they conquer Granada also in 1492. So to just sort of think about the significance of the year 1492, not only in the context of Columbus's voyages, but also the expulsion of the Jews from the peninsula and the conquest of Granada, the ways that all of these dynamics begin to shape and change emerging definitions of nation and of Spanishness in this period. The sort of Spain as a nation really doesn't exist prior to the 16th century. There were, again, multiple kingdoms, but it's at this moment in the early 16th century that we see sort of growing, sort of a growing push for religious and political unity. And this leads also to the forced baptisms of the Muslim population in Granada. So unlike previous, unlike what was happening in previous centuries, and with the immediate surrender treaties that were negotiated with the fall of Granada, the Muslim population was allowed to continue to practice Islam, even as they were falling under Christian control, and to maintain their own institutions. But the Muslim population was facing increasing pressures, and this leads to the first rebellion against what they saw as the violations of the terms that were set up in the surrender treaties protecting their social and legal status. When this first rebellion in Granada is suppressed by royal forces in 1500, 1501, the Muslim population is faced with the impossible choice to either accept baptism or be exiled from Granada and from the peninsula. So many Muslims at this point in time in 1500 are baptized. They convert nominally to Christianity. And as time passes, this raises a number of questions for religious authorities concerning their religiosity and a great deal of scrutiny of the Morisco population. So once they've been baptized, they are now referred to as Moriscos, and they're now subject to the Inquisition, that as an institution was set up to try baptized Christians. So this also this changes their legal status. And Moriscos throughout the 16th century face growing suspicions as to their religiosity and also their loyalty. This is a point in time when political loyalty is increasingly being associated with religious identity. And in the broader context of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, this makes religious identity an important concern on the part of Spanish officials. And as I mentioned, has profound implications for people's social and legal status. So in Granada, by the 1520s, Moriscos are subject to the Inquisition, even as there's a period of edicts of grace that were issued, a period where they were recognized as new converts. Missionaries were sent in to catechize the Moriscos. But increasingly, all aspects of Morisco's daily life were subject to the scrutiny of Spanish officials. So everything from dress, from the types of food that they ate, to the rituals surrounding births, marriages, and deaths. All of these fell under scrutiny, where the older ceremonies were prohibited. Anything that authorities remotely associated with Islam were prohibited, from the naming ceremonies at the birth of Morisco children, ceremonies involving circumcision, to the marriage ceremonies and funerals. All of these now had to conform to the Christian sacraments surrounding baptism, marriage, and last rites. Sort of involved all aspects of their daily lives, and not just things that were associated with Islam, praying in Arabic, speaking in Arabic. The Moriscos were prohibited from speaking in Arabic, and even festivals, playing music, dancing, singing songs in Arabic, eating couscous. I read an Inquisition trial where Moriscos threw a party and were tried for, among other things, eating couscous. So all of these things become conflated in the eyes of not only inquisitors, but also Moriscos neighbors. So the ways that Moriscos were being sort of constructed and represented, the discourses that surrounded them. And so this was a problem that I was having earlier. I can no longer, when I'm in the screen share mode, I can't move from slide to slide. Okay. So but by the mid 16th century, the Moriscos, facing all of these pressures, rise up in another major uprising in the Alpujarras Mountains outside of Granada between 1568 and 1570, in protest against the conditions that they were facing. And when this uprising is suppressed by royal forces in 1570, the Morisco population in Granada is, many Moriscos are forcibly resettled to other parts of the peninsula to live amongst old Christian families, and other Moriscos are enslaved after the uprising. And this also has a direct impact on the Moriscos who arrive in the Americas, both as free immigrants, but also a number of enslaved Moriscos who were taken captive during the Alpujarras uprisings. So when we think about the the term Morisco, it again refers to a really broad range of people who might have identified as devout Muslims or as devout Christians. By the early 17th century, it's important to remember that many generations passed since the forced baptisms. And there was also a Morisco population across the Iberian Peninsula, individuals who converted voluntarily to Christianity in the late 15th, early 16th century in other places. But when the Granadan Moriscos are forcibly resettled to other parts of the peninsula, this also begins to raise a number of questions and suspicions for Spanish authorities that begin to conflate all Moriscos as potentially disloyal subjects who might ally with the Ottoman Empire. A lot of ideas about inheritance in the context of the notions of limpieza de sangre, or the blood purity laws that were put into place that also affected not just Moriscos, but also conversos. So one sort of final point of context to keep in mind are the impacts of the discourses surrounding limpieza de sangre that placed limits on individuals' abilities to hold prestigious offices, to attend university, and also to emigrate to Spanish America. So what was limpieza de sangre? This was the idea that descent from Christians took precedence over people who had Muslim or Jewish ancestry. And this led to large numbers of court cases, of lawsuits, of individuals going to court to try to accuse a rival of not only practicing Judaism or Islam in secret, but also descending, having Muslim or Jewish ancestors. And this leads to the exclusion, even after several generations, of people with Muslim and Jewish ancestry from, as I mentioned, prestigious offices, certain professions, and both Moriscos and conversos were prohibited from emigrating to Spanish America. So in this next portion of my talk, I wanted to talk about some of the challenges that individuals faced in emigrating to the Americas. What was the process of emigrating? If you were able to emigrate freely, as I mentioned, the number of Moriscos had been enslaved and were taken for limited periods of time to labor in primarily the elite households of colonial officials in the Americas. But in the case of free immigrants, there were a number of procedures that were put into place for anyone who wanted to travel to the lands that were claimed by Spain in the Western Hemisphere. This connected to Spanish authorities' anxieties about religion, about defining their nation and empire as a Catholic empire in the context of both rivalries with the Ottoman Empire and also the Protestant Reformation. Definitions of citizenship were very much connected to religious identity in this period. So in order to emigrate to the Americas, you had to travel to the House of Trade in Seville and put together a fairly elaborate license that involved summoning witnesses to testify to your behavior, that you were a good Christian, and also that you descended only from Christians. And it's in this context that number of individuals who I located in court cases and in Inquisition records in the Americas, individuals who were able to find a variety of ways to circumvent the restrictions, either by summoning witnesses to testify on their behalf, when they were trying to obtain licenses, obtaining falsified licenses. But you could also enlist as a soldier or a sailor and travel to the Americas that way, with the idea that you wouldn't leave the ship that you were stationed on. But a number of individuals jumped ship and pursued their lives in the Americas. A number of individuals also accompanied some of the major expeditions to Spanish America, and I'll talk about a couple of those cases a little bit later in my talk. One of the individuals that I read about in the Mexican Inquisition records was Diego Herrador. He was a shoemaker living in Mexico City, and he ends up, before the Inquisition, having been denounced for having falsified his license to emigrate to Mexico. And he talks a little bit about the process of changing his name and purchasing, how he was able to purchase a license to travel, and then set sail from a port in the Canary Islands to Lisbon, and then to Mexico, encountering fewer restrictions, fewer controls that way. And his case really speaks to others, to the ways that individuals were able to find ways to get around some of these restrictions and try to forge new lives for themselves, especially in an area that they hoped was distant enough from the tensions, the scrutiny that Moriscos were facing on the Iberian Peninsula. In Spanish America, the cases that I have looked at sort of speak to the diversity of the Morisco population in the Americas too, individuals who pursued a range of professions and were, whether they were bakers, artisans, healers, some individuals who accompanied the initial expeditions to the Americas, in each case hoping to gain a better life that was farther from the scrutiny that they were facing in Spain. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ways that Moriscos fell under the scrutiny of inquisitors, some of the dynamics that surrounded the patterns of accusation that we see before the inquisitorial tribunals, and then think about some of the individual cases of people who tried to forge lives for themselves. So a number of professions were associated with Moriscos, and the denunciations that we see before the Mexican tribunal. So some people were denounced for being Moriscos because they were bakers, because they were seen baking buñuelos, a small type of pastry that the person who was denouncing them associated with Moriscos. Moriscos in Spain were also associated with the silk industry in Granada that had really thriving silk and textile industry in the 15th and 16th centuries. And a number of officials in Mexico actually request that Moriscos be allowed to travel to Mexico to try to establish a silk industry in New Spain in the 16th century. Many of these requests were officially denied, but I have come across cases of Moriscos who were involved as silk spinners and weavers in Mexico City. A number of Moriscos were also appear as healers, individuals who were sought after for their skills in healing and in cases involving magical practice, divination, love magic. In both Spain and Spanish America, Moriscos were associated with practicing magic. And we see a number of individuals who made a living carrying out cures or providing remedies for individuals who were seeking to find a love or a partner. So I'll now turn to the next slide to talk about a handful of individuals whose cases are really striking and can tell us a lot about the challenges that individual Moriscos faced in this broader context of a society that really valued their skills, their abilities, but that was also experiencing changing definitions of nation, of what Spanishness and citizenship meant, and in the context of changing ideas about status as they were connected to emerging ideas of race in this period. So by the first person who I wanted to mention, who many of you may already be familiar with, is Estebanico, who was born in Morocco in the early 16th century, and he's enslaved by the Portuguese and taken to New Spain, and he ends up on the expedition of Panfilo de Narvaez to Florida in 1527. The expedition is shipwrecked, and four of the survivors, Estebanico, Andres Dorantes, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who writes an account of their experiences, they begin to travel across what's today the US South and Southwest through Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, before they finally reach a party of Spaniards who are traveling northwards from Mexico City. And it's interesting to think about the ways that Estebanico is represented in the existing sources. Unfortunately, we don't have accounts that were written by him. We don't have his own perspectives as we do for many of the other Moriscos who have written about Estebanico, perhaps because his status as being enslaved is only represented in the narrative that's written by Cabeza de Vaca and a number of the accounts of services to the crown, reports that were written after the events by Andres Dorantes and by his I think, grandson, Baltasar Dorantes de Carranza, who writes a history also of the expedition. Estebanico is valued for his skills as an interpreter and as a healer. He very quickly learns a number of the indigenous languages that are spoken in Texas, in what's today Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and serves as an interpreter. And when for men who had been shipwrecked finally reunite with the Spaniards in northern New Spain, Estebanico is then sent on a later expedition by the Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza to accompany Friar Marcos de Niza's expedition to sort of search for these mythical cities. And Estebanico, like other Moriscos, acts as an interpreter and also as a healer. He's referenced by Cabeza de Vaca in his account for his skills as a healer. And even as we don't know much about Estebanico's own experiences, a number of cases of Morisco healers and interpreters whose testimonies survive, and in a couple of instances whose probanzas or accounts survive, can sort of help us to understand the ways that they pursued their professions. They honed their skills as healers, as interpreters, in contexts that were also very charged politically with the increasing concerns and suspicions concerning individuals' religious identities. In Cabeza de Vaca's account, it's interesting to think about how he ends his account by making reference to a Morisca in Spain who prophesied the outcome of the expedition. Cabeza de Vaca refers to sort of before the ships departed for Florida, that Morisca said that if the Spaniards traveled inland, terrible things would befall them. But if anyone survived the expedition, then they would cause miracles to happen. And so it's interesting to see how Moriscos are being associated with prophecies, their role as diviners, as healers, practitioners of love magic, and how this plays out in the context of individuals who are practicing their professions, cases of Moriscas in Mexico City, or people who claim to learn their techniques for healing from Moriscas. Another person who I wanted to talk about briefly is Maria Ruiz. She denounces herself to the Mexican Inquisition in 1594, and she speaks about her childhood in Granada and her attempts to continue to practice Islam once she reaches Mexico as an adult. She is married to an old Christian, but nonetheless attempts to pray in the way that her parents taught her when she was a little girl in Granada. And her testimony is really interesting. It speaks to the pressures that Moriscos faced in Granada. She talks about her parents' caution in teaching her prayers in Arabic and how to fast during the holy month of Ramadan. And she and the testimonies of other Moriscas about their childhoods sort of attest to the caution that parents had to face to continue to practice Islam, even as they were facing the possibility of denunciations by their old Christian neighbors. In Mexico, Maria Ruiz, after the Alpujarras uprising, she's resettled in another part of Spain. She marries an old Christian who's a wine merchant, and they moved to Mexico City, and she lives in Mexico City for about 10 years, continuing to practice Islam in secret, but then denounces herself to inquisitors, saying that she now wants to live as a Christian, and is very concerned with her salvation. And this is another theme that we see in the context of Moriscos denouncing themselves before the Inquisition, concerns about salvation, whether they would be saved as Muslims or as Christians. And on the one hand, using the Inquisition as a way to incorporate themselves into the Christian community. But there's also evidence, and it's unclear why some individuals denounce themselves, that there is also the possibility that they were fearing that a rival or a neighbor might denounce them. And by denouncing yourself, you wouldn't face the harsh penalties that anybody tried by the Inquisition could potentially face. So if you denounced yourself, you might be sentenced to say a few prayers and to obtain religious instruction. So there are a number of strategies that people who were suspected of being Moriscos used if they thought that they might face denunciations before the Inquisition. And then finally, the last case that I wanted to talk about very briefly is that of Diego Romero and how his status might also shed some light on the social position of Estebanico, maybe what might have happened had Estebanico survived the expedition to the Zuni Pueblo and gained his freedom from slavery. Diego Romero, I read about his case in the context of an encomienda dispute in New Granada in what's today Colombia. In 1558, he is denounced by a rival who travels 3,000 miles to Spain to scour the archives for evidence that Diego Romero was actually a North African slave who escapes, who runs away, travels to what's today Colombia, and participates in one of the first expeditions, the Jimenez de Quesada expedition. Diego Romero has, by 1558, when this dispute is taking place, he has a great deal of status and recognition in his community. And this is in part shown by the fact that he holds an encomienda, a grant of indigenous labor that was apportioned to the early conquerors of a region. And he finds individuals to testify that it shouldn't matter what his ancestry is, whether he was a Muslim, a Christian, enslaved or free, that it's his service to the crown, his loyalty, and his actions during the expedition that should allow him to hold high status in New Granada. And he eventually wins his court case. And this is also significant when we think about the broader context of the suspicions surrounding Moriscos, the vulnerability to denunciations, there was also a degree of fluidity in colonial society, where reputation sometimes mattered more than religious ancestry, and where if you could summon individuals to testify to your honor, to testify on your behalf, that you could rise to positions of high status, which again raises questions about whether this would have been the case for Estebanico had he survived the expedition. So what can we sort of take away from all of the cases that I've been talking about? Why does it matter to study the history of Moriscos in the Americas? On the one hand, it can tell us a great deal about ideas of citizenship and emerging ideas about race in this period, the ways that Moriscos were constructed, the ways that the category of Morisco emerges as a legal category, as a label, and how people respond to that, how they try to push back against that label, how individuals were able to go to court to negotiate their status, and sometimes petition successfully for recognition of their status and loyalty to the crown. So it speaks to the fluidity of status and identities in this period as well. So with those points, I'll maybe end there, and I very much look forward to your questions, and apologize again for the PowerPoints not working. I'm sorry that for the technical difficulties. So yeah, I really look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cook. If you have any questions or comments, as I mentioned before, please put them in the chat box, and I will try to ask those. Just bear with me a moment. Let's see. There's one comment that maybe you could respond to. Moriscos were Spanish Muslims who converted to Catholicism during the Reconquista of Spain, and it became a pejorative term to those who had outwardly converted but secretly continued to practice Islam.
Definitely. So yeah, in response, yeah, I definitely think that it's important to think about what the term Morisco means, what's implied by Morisco as a label. People very often didn't refer to themselves as Moriscos. This appears in the context of denunciations, of Inquisition cases, and a number of legal records as well, where the label Morisco would be included alongside somebody's name in a court case or a particular type of record. And again, it's sort of a blanket term that refers to a really broad and diverse range of people who might have identified as Muslims, as Christians, and who came from a variety of places, not just the Iberian Peninsula. So it was a label that could be applied to people born in Morocco, in Algiers, Iran, Tunis, in the Americas. And yeah, to think about the implications of what that label means, and what happens when people went to court to in response to accusations that they were Moriscos.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question. Do you know of contemporary examples of people exploring their Morisco history and returning to Islam?
In the Americas, I haven't come across cases. In Morocco, there is sort of a strong memory of the history of the Moriscos in Spain, individuals who and communities who are connected to the Morisco exiles from Spain. But in Spanish America, not so much. I haven't come across cases. The individuals who have been looking at, we don't really see in the context of communities of Moriscos, more people who were acting as individuals traveling on their own, and so that memory sort of doesn't survive over the course of generations.
Okay. We have a couple more here, bear with me. Are you familiar, or is anyone else in our group familiar with any evidence of Moriscos in New Mexico?
With the exception of Estebanico, not in New Mexico specifically, but in New Spain broadly, many cases.
Okay. Here's one more question. In the early 90s, I met Spanish Muslim, and one of them claimed their family secretly remained Muslim throughout the centuries. Have you encountered individuals such as those?
Yeah, so again, not in the context of Spanish America, but in Spain and definitely in Morocco, there are many families who have strong connections and memories of their histories in Spain prior to the expulsions.
Okay. Let me take a look. One other, just a comment if you choose to respond. Racism seems to have started in Spain through the idea of blood purity established by the Christian monarchs in the 1400s.
Yeah, so I would say, I don't know if that's where racism starts, but there's definitely an changing ideas and emerging ideas about race in this period that are very much connected to the ways that religious ancestry was being privileged in the sources, the ways that you had to prove descent from only Christians in order to access certain types of professions, prestigious offices, and immigration to the Americas. So yeah, this preoccupation with ancestry as time progresses, and the categories that are created also. So Morisco, Converso as well, and then the categories in colonial society. Mestizo, mulatto, with labels that are being applied to people with indigenous, African, and Spanish ancestry. So each of these labels also are constructed and operate in similar ways to the way that the category of Morisco is operating in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then these categories then sort of harden by the 18th and 19th centuries that become more closer to how we think of race today.
One observation comment. In Chicago, I meet Mexicans with the name Tariq, Omar, and Ubaid, which are Muslim names, so that in spite of the Inquisition, these cultural traits through names seemingly have survived.
Potentially. I mean, there's also been a lot of more recent immigration from Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine in the 19th and 20th centuries to Mexico, Peru, Colombia.
There's a question from Habiba Akil. And if you could unmute yourself, you have your hand up.
Salams to everyone, which means peace to everyone. I have a couple of questions. First of all, it was very interesting to find out about MORISCOS. And I want to know that down centuries, like it was probably in the 15th and the 16th century, that these people were known as MORISCOS. Do you think they lost the name of MORISCOS as we progressed into 21st century and people probably just call themselves Spanish Muslims or Muslim Spanish Muslims or Spaniards, but don't reveal their religion? And second question was, of course, MORISCOS is not used that much here, but maybe if you can throw a little more light on the same question as to if they still exist in Morocco, as you said, and in Portugal or in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. And the other question I had was about where the Jews also targeted like the Muslims were in Spain. I guess they were they also asked to change their religion, and what did they do? Did they migrate over to other countries, or were they, or did they change their religion, or what happened to their religious set of people who practice Judaism?
Thank you so much for your questions. Those are really great questions. I'll answer your last question first. So in the context of Jews and conversos, yes, they were subject to the same restrictions as the Moriscos. And so yeah, the limpieza de sangre or purity of blood statutes, the subjection to inquisitorial prosecution, and also restrictions on their movement, their ability to emigrate to the Americas. So because the Spanish Empire in the 16th century was defining itself as a Catholic empire, there were sort of papal bulls that were obtained to sort of bolsters support for Spanish claims in the Americas. This meant that both conversos and Moriscos were officially prohibited from emigrating. So yeah, the status of the conversos is very similar. And there were also anxieties that were sort of expressed differently. In the case of the Moriscos, there were anxieties that they would ally with the Ottoman Empire, for example. And so the Moriscos were cast as potentially disloyal subjects, and these suspicions sort of persist throughout the 16th century. And so the anxieties surrounding conversos are defined differently, but there are a number of periods of prosecutions of conversos in the context of the Inquisitions in Peru, Mexico, and Cartagena de Indias, what's a city in the northern coast of what's today Colombia. There were fairly large converso communities in each of these major port cities and capital cities of the viceroyalties. And in the context of the conflicts, the growing tensions between Spain and Portugal in the mid 17th century, this also leads to a wave of prosecutions and denunciations of conversos before the Inquisitions in these areas. So yeah, in each context, the ways that loyalty, nationality, and religious identity are being conflated in very sort of strategic ways. have direct implications for conversos and moriscos in these areas. In terms of the label morisco, in terms of people calling themselves or being labeled Morisco. This sort of disappears from the documents by the 18th century. Following the expulsions of Moriscos from Spain between 1609 and 1614, at least officially, you don't see Moriscos necessarily appearing in the documents anymore. We do know that some families did return to Spain, either coming back in through France or the Pyrenees, and also, importantly to remember too, not all Moriscos were expelled, even with the edicts of expulsion. Many small Morisco communities outside of Granada were defended by their parish priests, who said that the Moriscos were loyal Christians, and in some instances also don't face expulsion. So yeah, the label Morisco isn't really used as much after the mid-17th century, and by the 18th century, you don't tend to see it anymore. And with the exception of histories that are written about the Moriscos. So yeah, I don't know if that answers all of your questions. Definitely let me know if you want me to elaborate on anything.
Okay, thank you. We'll take, if you're willing to field just one or two more questions. It's after midnight.
Yeah, no.
One question is, did Moriscos practice circumcision?
They did, and this was, they were also denounced before inquisitors for practicing circumcision. So yeah, one of the things that Moriscos really complained about in Granada, they were forced to sort of leave their doors open on Sundays, so their neighbors could sort of look in and see what they were doing. Morisco midwives were prohibited from practicing their professions, from acting as midwives, especially for other Morisco families, because there were anxieties that Morisca midwives would circumcise babies. So yeah, this also goes into the anxieties about and the denunciations of Moriscos in Granada and in the Americas as well. Diego Romero was actually accused of also being circumcised.
Okay. And one final question. Do you see any connection between those early understanding of Moriscos and current attitudes toward immigrants in Spain? Is there something in Spanish nationalism today and what you described as the origins of the Spanish nation?
Yeah, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, yes. Here we go. Do you see any connection between those early, and I'm just reading word for word, early understanding, excuse me, of Moriscos and current attitudes toward immigrants in Spain? Is there something in Spanish nationalism today and what you described as the origins of the Spanish nation as opposed to Islamist and Jewish presence in the peninsula before 1492? I'm a little perplexed by that, but perhaps you have better insights.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that in terms of anxieties about immigration today, whether it's in Spain, in the US, and the UK, we see sort of similar discourses surfacing that were applied to the Moriscos. And in terms of the ways that maybe rather than today specifically, nationalist discourses in Spain under Franco are very much connected to definitions of Spain as a Catholic nation, where the histories of Christianity and Rome, the Roman Empire, so that history in some ways is sort of privileged over the Islamic history and the importance of Islam in the peninsula. And when it's written about in very negative ways in the context of the Reconquista and discourses surrounding this idea of the Reconquista or reconquest as something that was sort of a unified program to assume, to sort of reclaim a pristine Christian Spain and completely ignoring the long Muslim and Jewish histories and presence. So I don't know how well I answered that question, but these discourses do persist and connect to contemporary nationalist.
Right.
And
Well, again, yeah. Well, again, Dr. Cook, thank you so much for your time. There were several comments how much they appreciated and enjoyed your talk this afternoon here in the US, or very late at night or early tomorrow morning in the United Kingdom. And I want to thank our friends and colleagues at the Islamic Center of New Mexico for co-sponsoring this with us. We hope that we'll have other opportunities in the near future. And I want to thank Gordon Brunitsky for bringing us all together this afternoon. So everyone, thank you again. Stay well, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Bye-bye.
And thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for all your questions.
We enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Dr. Cook.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Get
Good
some
night.
sleep.